Hey, so this is part two of the first video I did um, about me having my first Christmas with the Clauses, basically them saving my life, um, and basically my testimony leading up to my relationship with God and where it's brought me now. So I left, I left off with my biological mother about to come back into my life. So um, one evening, Holly and I were just hanging out at the house. And at this point, I hadn't spoken to my biological mother in a very long time. And we were hanging out at the house and playing Mario Brothers because that's what we did all the time. And the phone rang, and she jumped up and got it and brought it to me and said, "Hey, it's your mom." So I figured it was my stepmom. And so I got on the phone. She goes, "Hey, son," and I knew it was my biological mom, and it was just kind of um, came out of left field. So she told me that she had been living in Knoxville, Tennessee, and we just kind of had a chat, and she wanted to come up to visit. And something that was odd about that day is I think it was the day before, or maybe 2 days before this happened. You ever wake up and there's a song in your head and you don't know how it got there? And it's just playing on repeat. I woke up and I had Knoxville in my head. My brain kept saying to me, Knoxville, Knoxville, Knoxville. And to be honest with you, I've heard of Nashville, but I must have heard Knoxville somewhere, but it wasn't in my consciousness. I just knew, the only thing I knew about the South was Nashville, which was, country music capital, even though I didn't really listen to country music, but everyone knows Nashville. And I had Knoxville in my head, just repeating over and over and over again. And it wasn't when I had the conversation with my mom when she said she was living in Knoxville that it clicked. But I think it was the day after I realized, like, oh crap, I had that in my head all day. But at this point, with the things that were happening in my life, things were getting really strange. I wasn't surprised, but it was really neat. So she had planned to come up for Christmas, the next Christmas. And so she was made her plans, and I made my plans. I was pretty excited to see her. And it was interesting. I didn't know her, but our conversation on the phone, she talked a lot about God and her newfound faith. And at this time, we were talking God consciousness, not really a religious view of God, but the Christ consciousness, the God consciousness and stuff. And I found it interesting because it was a new perspective. So I wasn't sure I wanted to get her a gift, but I had no idea who she was, so I didn't know what to do. But I happened to be in this little department store, and I didn't have any money, so the few bucks that I had, I found this little framed picture, and you might have seen it before. It's like one of those kind of drawing of an angel that was hovering over two young kids in the woods, and they seemed to be lost, and they're walking across this little bridge, and the angel was like protecting them. Anyways, I saw that, and I'm like, she might like that, and it's something I can afford, so I got her this little framed painting. And it was funny because the day that she arrived, she knocked on the door, and when I answered it, we were wearing the exact same thing. We were both wearing a green sweatshirt, blue jeans, and black boots. And I found it funny. I was like, wow, we're dressed exactly the same, And it's just kind of odd when you're around family, not really around family that you're around all the time, like your immediate family. You don't really notice these similarities in the way you think and the way you act and your opinions because you're just used to it. But if you meet either distant relatives or family you haven't seen in quite a long time, it's interesting the connection that's there. There's something to be said about blood. And I just noticed how we had that blood connection we were talking, we just understood each other and we clicked, and the things that she would say or the things that I would say were finishing each other's sentences. It was really kind of neat for not really knowing each other at all, but being able to have this deeper, more mystical connection that comes with family. It kind of reminds me of my little brother had his little girl Ryan, and just a few weeks after she was born, I made my way to his house. He lived in North Carolina at the time, to see my new niece. And I was holding this little newborn, and she was just like a little peanut. And when every baby to me just looks like a baby. I don't have kids of my own, so, but it was interesting. I was holding her, and I would see members of my family flash across her face, like in these really quick instances. Like I saw my grandma there, and then my uncle, and I saw my brother, my sister, saw my dad. It was neat to hold her, and just the little micro expressions. I mean, she's like basically asleep. She's just a baby that's kind of throwing her arms around and just, she wasn't even throwing her arms around at this point. It was just the little expressions on her face while I was holding her and she was sleeping. I just saw my family, like all of my family, just flash across her face, and it was amazing to behold. And that's the kind of blood connection that I'm talking about. There's a history in your blood that is deeper than you realize. So it was interesting. So anyways, it came to be Christmas time, and we gave each other our presents, and I gave her little print, and she gave me this like throw blanket, like a woven throw blanket that had the exact same image on it of the angel guiding the two children across the bridge. It was par for the course that weekend. Everything that was going on was really interesting. So, as I was saying before, when I woke up and had Knoxville in my head, and like I said, it was a day after, a few days later, before this all clicked. And at this time, I was dreaming pretty heavy, like every night, another lucid dream. So the night before I woke up with Knoxville in my head, I had this dream that I woke up in my room, and I knew that I was dreaming. So I got up and did my routine, looked at my hands, and then looked at myself in the mirror. And looking at yourself in the mirror when you're dreaming is weird. But I walked out into the backyard and walked back towards the woods where I had my first encounter with God. And there was this woman who came out of the woods, and she was really tall and had long curly red hair and was wearing this white dress. And she came up to me and said something to me, and I didn't understand what she was saying verbally because she was speaking some other language. And she turned to go, and I grabbed her hand. I didn't want her to leave. So she turned back around and said something else to me. I don't know what she said. But then she said something and then went back off into the woods. And that's when I woke up. When I woke up and had Knoxville like a song playing in my head. Didn't really put the two together. Didn't really think much about it. I mean, I thought about the dream, but I didn't know what it meant, if it meant anything. And my mom always, in all the pictures that I had, she had really dark chocolate hair with a white stripe that went down the back. And I'm actually starting to get that stripe now that I'm in my 40s. I don't know if you can see it or not, but I'm starting to get this white stripe right here. But she always had dark hair with this white stripe, like the Bride of Frankenstein kind of stripe. And when she answered the door, she had big head of red curly hair. She had colored her hair red and it was long curly red hair. Still didn't click. And it didn't really click with me until after she left, that I think the dream that I had was of her. So I started getting this. I wanted to get to know her. And I was in college at the time, and I was bummed with it, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And it felt like my time in New York was kind of, It was getting dull and I needed a change. But I was, you know, it's not like I was gonna like just move to Knoxville, but I wanted to go see her. So at break, school break, I decided I was going to go down to Knoxville for a month and get to know her. And then the plan was I was supposed to come back up, move to Boston, and marry Holly, who was going to Boston University at the time. So I went down to Knoxville, and uh, obviously I didn't go back. I never went back to New York to live. Um, I got to Knoxville and was hanging out with my mom. Decided I was going to stay a little longer than a month. And I went and found this little crappy apartment at the Fifth Avenue Motel in Knoxville, which I didn't know at the time because upstate New York was all country, really rural. We didn't have homelessness. We didn't have any of that stuff. Didn't have like bad areas really. But I found this little place for rent that was like $375 a month, including utilities, and I was like, I can afford that. And didn't realize at the time it was like the place in Knoxville that nobody wanted to live. It was one step above homelessness. Most of the people that I met there were drug addicts, alcoholics, mental patients. I mean, it was one step above living under a bridge. It was an interesting time because I lived there for 2 years. Never once was robbed. There were people getting robbed and beaten. I saw a guy get stabbed, like gutted, out on the sidewalk. And it was a regular occurrence. A lot of bad stuff happened there. A lot of demonic stuff happened when I lived there in my apartment. Just lots of demonic dreams and bad things had happened. But I think God put me there for a reason. And I met some amazing people. One person in particular named Gary, and his nickname was Monster, which is kind of funny because he's he was this older guy, called himself the Urban Indian, and he was mentally ill, and he would spend years being homeless, and then he would come to himself, and then get his check from the government and find himself a place to live, and until his mind took over him again, and he would just wander off into the streets. And he walked around barefoot, called himself the Barefoot Indian, and he was like the salt of the earth. And the way I met him was I backed into his car. He had this little blue Yugo. I don't know if you remember Yugos. It's this little roller skate of a car. And I was backing out of this really tight parking lot to get out, and I just barely bumped his car. And it was already covered in dents, so I didn't know if I dented it or not. But I found him and told him, and he was so surprised that I even told him. And he was perfectly nice to me, and he lived out in the hall. And then after that encounter, he had a room became available right across the hall from me, and suddenly he was living right across the hall from me. And I found out later that he talked to the building manager. Her name was Dot, this little tiny mouse of a woman that you did not want to mess with. I mean, she was this tiny old lady, but she ran that place. All these thugs and thieves, and she ran that place. Monster Gary had come to her and told her to let him know if that room across the way becomes available, because he wanted it. And the reason why was because he knew that I wasn't like everybody there, that I was just getting started, and he wanted to watch out for me. Gary was interesting. I ended up being friends with him, and I go across the hall, and these people that lived here had nothing. I mean, nothing. Most of them were on government assistance. They would get their checks and they would drink it. Monster didn't drink, but he had this, I call it a demon, where he would, I'd go over to his house and we'd watch the History Channel. And back then we called it the Hitler Channel because all History Channel was like Nazi documentaries. But we'd watch the History Channel and just kind of hang out. And then suddenly he would start dropping his head like he's falling asleep. And he'd start muttering to himself. And I learned quickly that that was the cue to get out of there. Because he would lose his mind. And he would destroy everything in his apartment. I mean, everything. I was there one time. He had his dog named Buddy. And Buddy was a buddy. He was just a big old marshmallow, huge dog. But I was sitting on the couch one time and I had drank a Coke. And I had set the empty Coke can on the table in front of me, and I was just watching this documentary, and I was into it. So I didn't notice that Gary was starting to go into one of his spells until Buddy came up and stood there at my knees and just stared at me, like staring a hole into me. And I heard him whine a little bit, and I looked at him, and I looked up at Monster, and I saw him. His head was just down like this. He was going into it. Right about the time I realized, I gotta get out of here, because there's nothing you can do. There's no reaching him. He's completely gone. He won't recognize you. He's just... before I could even react, Gary jumped up out of his recliner and grabbed that empty can of Coke and threw it across the room so hard that it went pop through the window and landed in the street. An empty can of Coke went through a window. And that was like superhuman strength. So I grabbed Buddy and we got out of there. And he slammed the door so hard behind me, it just like kicked dust out of the door frame. Pow! And there's nothing I could do. I would just sit there in my room and listen to him scream and destroy everything. Just destroy everything that he owned. Screaming in agony. And he would often talk about the lords and masters that were in his head, and that they were trying to control his thoughts. He called them Nazis, and he called them the lords and masters. And then it would get quiet after the episode was over. Usually within about an hour he would stop, and it would get quiet, and after enough time would pass, I would knock on his door to check on him, and he'd open the door, and he would just be exhausted. And I'd come in and sit down, and his house would just be trashed, and he'd be sitting on his chair, a little sheepish, seeming like a little embarrassed, but we never spoke about it. And he'd just sit there in this completely destroyed apartment. Everything was destroyed. And since he didn't drink, he did get a government assistance check because of his mental illness. He would just go buy new stuff. He didn't have a whole lot of vices. He smoked a lot of pot, and he sold little bags of weed, dime bags, to people coming by. And he made extra money. So he'd just go buy new stuff, and until the next episode, and then he'd destroy it. So while there, the dreams kept coming. I kept having these dreams. And while I was there, I had the worst nightmare I've ever had in my life was in that place. And I think it was because there was so much depravity in that building. And it was an old building. So there had been, people die there on the regular, overdose, drink themselves to death. There was over at Monster's apartment, there were people that would just stop by. Monster was like a hub. And sometimes his apartment would be full, and most people were homeless or almost homeless. There were, horrible drug addicts, alcoholics, lifelong alcoholics. Clifford in particular was one of the guys that came by, and he was a Vietnam vet. He did 2.5 tours in Vietnam, and he was a field medic. And he looked the part. I mean, he was homeless by choice. Little old, you know, the lifelong alcoholic face that's all wrinkled and tough as nails, but it's interesting to me that I'm this baby-faced, clean-cut kid there, and they accepted me as one of their own. They all knew that I wasn't in that. They knew I wasn't in that life. I wasn't out on the corner. I wasn't selling drugs. I wasn't an alcoholic. I wasn't a drug addict. You know, I walked to work, you know, most days because I found a job working in a restaurant a couple blocks away. But they just accepted me. And I remember if something was happening, a lot of times Gary would come by and knock on my door and say, stay in here, because something was happening. There was a shooting or a stabbing, or somebody was loose and they're trying to wrangle somebody, and he would make sure I stayed in my apartment. One day I opened my door because I heard a scuffle and I didn't want my friends to get hurt, so I opened my door to help. And Monster, although is the sweetest guy, salt of the earth, like my buddy, when he's not having an episode, he turned on me and told me to go back and shut my effing door. And I knew he meant business. It scared me. I honestly think that Gary was sent by God to protect me. I learned so much living in that place. Just about myself. I mean, these people had nothing. There was this guy named Sam, who was, again, a lifelong addict. He used to be a chef. And this guy was on a government check. He got welfare or whatever his thing he got. I'm sure he had other mental illnesses besides, you know, his addictions. But for what little he had, when he would get his check at the end of the month, or beginning of the month, whatever it was, he would go grocery shopping, and in this tiny little efficiency dump of an apartment kitchen, he would make a feast for everybody. I remember he made a meatloaf one time, and I've never been able to recreate it. It was the most delicious thing, most delicious meatloaf I've ever had. And he would take this money that he used to live on, and he would just make a huge feast. And you could smell it all through the building. And you walk by his apartment, and there's just people in there, and he's just serving food for these people who lived on the streets. It wasn't like, you know, they were very careful about who came around. If they didn't know you, you weren't just walking in, you know. But it was the people that they had gained their trust and realized that they're not going to rob them, because there was a lot of thieves and violent, dangerous people around. So it's not like he was on the sidewalk doing a charity thing. He was just cooking and wanted to share what he had. And it taught me a lot about what it means to be a human being, even though these people had nothing. I'll tell you about Gary. I had this little car, but it was like falling apart. It needed new tires. The brakes were bad. It was a piece. It almost wasn't a car. But so I was walking to work, which I usually walk to work anyways because it was downtown and I had to pay to park, and it was a few blocks away. So, but anyways, my dad was really sick, and he lived up in Rhode Island at the time, and I was talking to Monster about my dad being sick, and I'm afraid he's gonna die, because it seemed like he has a bad heart, and it seemed like he was gonna die. And I was just kind of talking nonchalantly about it with Monster. And then the next day, while I was at work, he broke into my apartment and got my car keys. And he was a shade tree mechanic. He put all 4 new tires on it, fixed the radiator, replaced the brakes, got my car running, put $200 in the glove compartment. And this is before cell phones were everywhere, and he put his CB radio in the car and told me to go see my dad. And to this day, he will never let me repay him. And this guy had nothing, and he did this because he was good. And with the battles this guy was fighting, the demons that he was fighting, I mean, it's hard to imagine what it looked like and what was happening there unless you were there. But this guy was battling things that you can't possibly imagine. I can't imagine. I've seen it and I can't imagine. And this serious mental illness that he has, and along with his mental illness, physical illness, and living in squalor, basically. And he didn't owe me anything, and I'll never forget that he did that for me. You know, and I had no way to repay him anyways. You know, I would take him fishing and stuff, and you know, sometimes our little fishing excursions would end in him jumping out of the car and throwing rocks at passing cars on this interstate because he was having an episode. Those were scary times because he did not know who I was. He never attacked me, but it was like trying to wrangle an angry, psychotic cat to get it back in the car and get him home safe. But it was there, and there was a dark energy that was all through that place. It wasn't. I could feel it when I walked into the building because it was a dangerous place. There was a good chance that I could get robbed at any minute, stabbed. You know, it was happening all around me. It never happened to me though, and I think that was God and Gary. Gary was looking out for me, and Gary had commanded a lot of respect around that place. People knew not to mess with him, yeah, he was the man, and people knew not to mess with him. And I found out through other people that he had put the word out: "Don't touch. I'm off limits," as a victim. And just being in my apartment, I would have lots of bad dreams, or I would feel a presence. I would feel demonic oppression just on me. Like, it got to the point, it was so bad one time that just being home felt like a bad dream. You know, you have a nightmare and you can't escape this horror. You had a nightmare about a haunting or an entity or something like that, that oppressive feeling. It was like a dream, and I had this tiny little closet in my living room. I had a little tiny living room, kitchen, and a bedroom, and a bathroom. And there was a little tiny like coat closet, and I cleaned everything out of it, and I designated that as a safe place where I would go in there and pray. So I put a chair in there, and I actually wrote on the wall things to remind me what I'm praying for. And it ended up being the only place I could go to and feel it was clean, where as soon as I went in there and shut the door, I didn't feel any of that demonic oppression that was in that place. You know, fear and like illness and just and now that place has been condemned since. It was shut down, revitalized, and now it's an assisted living place, but it's for people, I think, with tuberculosis or something. I'm not sure exactly, but it's not a place you can just rent now. You have to be on, you know, some other thing. And most of the people that I knew there, besides Gary's still alive, still battling with his things, still extremely ill. But all the other people that I knew there, most of them are dead. Clifford, the Vietnam veteran, drank himself to death. There was a man named John that I called him Rip Van Keaton, and he was probably in his 70s. Um, called him Rip Van Keaton because I go to Monster's house and or his apartment, and John was always asleep for the first like 2 months. Every time I was there, I never actually spoke to him because he was sleeping on the couch, and he was a lifelong alcoholic. And when I had spoken to Gary a couple years ago, or a year ago, and just talking about the old days, and he said that John actually cleaned himself up, stopped drinking, but he did die. Um, a lot of the people are been killed or overdosed or died of disease, but Monster's still kicking, and he's still the same guy. Um, Still battling something I could not imagine. Um, so I had this little prayer room that I would go into, and that was the only place, and I'd walk out of it, and it was just like this heavy, like walking into smoke. I could not escape it while I was there, and it started getting heavier and heavier. And I had some horrible nightmares there, just seeing horned demons made out of smoke and light trying to get in to my apartment, and they tried to come in the front door, and in my dream I'm holding the door shut, so they make a new doorway that didn't exist before, and they would come in through there, and I'll never forget, I had this dream of this demonic entity trying to get into the house, and I was physically trying to hold the door shut, and I could see it like through the door, like in my mind's eye I saw it, and it had the face of like kind of like a goat, but really wide, and it had horns, and it was sitting there with its hands together like this, and it was just conjuring this power over me, and I was physically trying to hold the door shut, and it was futile because it was so powerful. So finally, and as I'm holding it shut, trying to keep it out of my house, it started levitating things off of my counter and throwing them at me, just like dishes that were on the counter. It was levitating them up and throwing them at me. And it irritated me, so finally I just flung the door open and saw it before me. And it's just, this evil just flooded into my house. And I knew that there was nothing I could personally do to stop it. I didn't have power over it. So, and this is one of those dreams where I didn't know I was dreaming. And it was one of those dreams where during the dream, I'd run back to my bed several times to try to wake up, you know. Um, and every time I'd wake back up, I think I would wake up and I was still in the dream. And so I opened this door and just flung it open like, let's dance. And I just hit my knees and started praying. And I'll never forget this. I started praying, and then my prayers turned into a song. I just started singing. And I don't know what I was singing, but it went from fear to absolute joy. I was just kneeling there, and this darkness was just like coming at me full throttle, and I had surrendered everything, and I was singing, and I felt like this joy come over me, and then the ceiling just collapsed in the kitchen, and I looked up and I saw God, and I saw Jesus standing next to him. And it was almost like the way I saw it was like in this traditional sort of imagery that I saw when I was a kid in the Jovinist publications of God sitting on this throne and Christ was standing next to him. And when I saw him, I was just like overjoyed because I knew that this thing that was coming after me was absolutely outmatched. And this demonic entity like flew out of the room, through my bedroom and out of the window, and I chased after it, like yelling at it, like, yeah, what? And it flew out the window, and I remember I yelled out, and stay out of here. And when I did, it was like this hurricane winds were coming out of my mouth, and it blew every remnant of its essence out of my house, and I slammed the window shut. And that was just one of many demonic dreams that I've had there. Um, so time went on, and I was going to church with my mom, and I wasn't really a church guy, especially because being a Jehovah's Witness, you're taught to fear church. That church is where, that's like the devil lives in church. But I had gone to church a few times with the Clauses, and Holly taught a little Sunday school class, and I would sit there with her, and it was probably more of a distraction than a help. And we taught like sixth graders, I think, or she taught sixth graders. And I've been to church a few times, but their church was a Dutch Reformed Protestant church in Kinderhook, New York, which might as well be Catholic. It's really grand, the red carpets and the pews and the big organ, and it's very reserved and quiet and very methodical. But then I go down to Knoxville, and my mom brings me to church, and she wanted me to go, and I'm like, yeah. So I went with her, and this was something I'd never seen before. I walk into this really modern, huge place, lights and a big stage and comfortable chairs, and of course, being her, she's on fire for it all the time. So I'm kind of a reserved person. She is not reserved at all, and I'm usually pretty reserved. And I'm around all these people I don't know, and we come in and go to sit down. Of course, she sits in the very front row. And the row behind us is empty because everyone's sitting back in the congregation. There's an empty row, and then us, the only people in this whole row sitting on the end. And she didn't tell me that she was the one that changed the music films on the little projection over the overhead projector for the praise and worship. So then she gets up and starts doing it, and I'm sitting in this row all by myself. The whole congregation just looking at the back of my head. It was so awkward. It was so uncomfortable, but I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And it was called the Knoxville Christian Center, and I'm not sure exactly what denomination it is, but it was really lively, and I wasn't used to people dancing and jumping up and down, and it was like rock music, and I've never worshipped that way. I just don't have that in me. Like I would rather listen to a sermon, than dance around. It's not that I don't appreciate or understand what worship is, and that people have joy. It's just that my joy is in a different place, and I've never been one to like sing and clap and stuff. And I would fake it sometimes, I felt so phony, but I just felt so odd that I was the only one. I'm sitting in the very front row that's not just like freaking out, dancing all over the place. And but I got used to it there, and there was a couple of sermons, and I found it started getting really difficult for me to be at church, and I didn't realize why this was happening, but I would just start bawling in the middle of a sermon, and I don't remember why. It got to the point where there was a different sermon going on in my head, I think, from what the minister was talking about, and I could not hold back. I would just start bawling, and it was joy, I think. I mean, I wasn't sad. Maybe I was sad. It was just like this purging or something was happening, but I had these encounters with the Holy Spirit that was excavating something out of me. And the thing was I wasn't just lock stock with that vibe in that church. I'm not a very trusting person when it comes. I don't trust the words of men. I don't trust the religion of men. I don't trust my own mind. I don't really trust my own heart. So if someone comes at me and tells me something, I never just believe it. I'm very suspicious, So it was, and there were some things in that church that I thought were weird. Like this guest speaker came, and I didn't know who this person was, but apparently he was a rock star in this congregation. He came to speak, and everyone was really excited. My mom was really excited. And he came to speak, and yeah, he gave a good sermon. And I was listening. Of course, we're sitting right in the front row still, months later. And this and he stopped, and he said, let's let us all pray in the Spirit. And when he said that, I thought that was so beautiful. That was really the first time I'd heard it spoken. Let's pray in the Spirit. And I was like, yeah, I can get with that. And then immediately it seemed like everybody just started like talking in tongues, like just like, to me, gibberish. And I was so deflated. I was like, what? And I knew right away that, I know that in the Bible it talks about speaking in tongues, but there's very specific things, very specific rules about it. Not rules, but the way it's supposed to be done, if it happens at all. And it really made me like, what are these people doing? How is this benefiting them or somebody else? How is this edifying God? How is this bringing glory or praise to the one we're there to worship? It seems like it was bringing glory and praise to themselves. And I've had plenty of people tell me what it means, like it's a spirit language, blah, 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 blah. And it might have some biblical basis, but from my experience of my relationship with God, that you can't turn it on and off like a spigot. Something that, a spirit that would fill you so powerfully that you actually speak in another language, that's not something you just decide to do. That's something that overwhelms you. And when he said, let's pray in the Spirit, immediately everybody just started doing this. My mom too. And I was just like, all right, whatever. So towards the end of the sermon, he called all the young people up front. And I think I was 21 at the time, 20, 21. And I was like, yeah, I guess that includes me. So he called all the young people up front, and we're all standing in a line in front of the stage or whatever. And he came down and he was praying for each person individually. And he told us to keep our heads bowed and our eyes closed in prayer. But of course, I'm going to look. So I look down the row, and I see these young people just laying on their backs. And I'm watching him like touch their forehead, and they're falling over. And my prayers changed right then. I said, God, if this isn't you, do not let me fall over. I was like, I don't want any part of this. I don't want this religious fervor or whatever this is. I don't want anything fake. I'm here for you. And I said, if this is not you, I'm trusting you to not let me hit the ground. Because to me, in my mind, this might have been something, some other spirit other than God's, because I didn't know. And they came up, and they got to the person to my left and started praying. And it was then I felt really, all of a sudden I didn't feel dizzy, but I felt like my legs were like one leg. All of a sudden I felt a little weird. And I had my head bowed, but my eyes were open, and I saw him come and stand in front of me. And before he opened his mouth, he didn't touch me or anything. Before he even said a word, I just went down. Somebody caught me. And it was really interesting because I wasn't like in a daze. I wasn't transported somewhere else. I knew exactly where I was. I knew I'd lain on the ground. I knew I was on the floor. I heard the conversations that were happening. I heard the preacher still preaching. I wasn't in some sort of like spiritual ecstasy or anything. I felt really calm. I felt comfortable. But at the same time knew like, yeah, so I'm laying on the ground. I'm laying on the floor of this church with hundreds of people around. And I remember I had my eyes closed, and they had the overhead lights that were pretty bright, and my eyes were closed. And I remember noting to myself that my eyelids, usually if I have my eyes closed looking at a light, I see red because of the blood vessels in my eyelids. But I didn't. This time I saw gold. And I remember thinking to myself, maybe I passed out because I have no blood in my head, and that's why I'm seeing gold. I don't have any blood in my eyelids. Maybe the blood drained out of my head or something. So anyway, I laid there for a few minutes, and I was like, well, I can't lay here forever. So I got up, and luckily I was in the front row, so my seat was right behind me. So I got up and sat down, and there was this man, and I can't remember his full name, but it's either his first or last name was Lee. I don't remember. He was this older man, gray head, gray beard, and he was sitting behind me, and he tapped me on the shoulder and whispered in my ear, and he said, "Hey, after the service, don't leave. I want to talk to you." And I was just like, okay. So after the service, I turned around and looked at him, and he was talking to some people. Everyone's greeting each other and saying goodbye or whatever. And then he came up to me and sat down when people had cleared out a little bit. And he said, Ben, he goes, God has only spoken to me once before in my life. And he said, it was when I was drinking. He said, I was a whiskey man. And he goes, and I was very faithful to my whiskey. And he goes, and I lost family, friends, my children. I chose that bottle over that and lost my life over this whiskey bottle. And I knew that I had to give it up, and I asked God for help. And for a lot of years, I would pray for God to take it from me, to help me not drink, and I continue to drink and continue to drink. And he goes, and God has only spoken to me once, and he said one word to me. He said, now. And he told me that he was praying about the whiskey. When help me put this down? How can I put this down? And he heard God's voice say now, which means put it down now. And he said, I put that bottle down, and I've never picked it back up again. And he said, but tonight God spoke to me again. And he goes, and he told me about you. And he said, when I was standing there, he said, I just had this unction to look at you. He said, so I raised my head and looked at you, and right as the minister, whatever his name was, came to me, he said, before the minister stepped fully in front of me, he said he saw me get wrapped up in this golden light. And then I went down, and they caught me and laid me on the floor. And he said, I heard God speak to my spirit and said that this is my son, and I am pleased with him. And he said, I will use him to deliver people from false religion and from addiction. He told me that, and I'm like, yeah, right, okay. And again, it's, cool. Tell me that. But at the same time, I'm thinking this is just another person with, who's wrapped up in the moment. He might have been one of the ones speaking in tongues. I didn't trust anything that anyone said to me. But he said it. And some strange things that happened there. Like, I was having an issue. I think in the church they were had a couple of sermons on the book of life. And if your name's not written in the book of life, then you're out of luck. And I remember battling with that within myself and wondering, like, there's no way I'm in the book of life. I just couldn't. Why would my name be in there? And I was kind of struggling with that. I've always had a hard time working out my salvation. And it was really strange. I was just thinking that to myself. Didn't share it with anybody. When I had gone to church with my mom another time, and before the service, there was a woman who, she was actually a licensed counselor that worked out of the church. She was a Christian counselor. And I had never really spoken to her before, but I knew who she was. And I'll never forget this encounter because her breath could kill a man. Like, it was a skinny, little, short-haired lady. And she wanted to talk to me and sat me in this chair while people were coming in. And she sat, like, right here. And her breath was just, whoa. Oh, my God, this poor lady. She needed a mint. But she just looked at me and she said, Ben, I have something to tell you. She said, God wants you to know that your name is in the book of life. So don't worry. And that was it. I was like, oh, okay. And that gave me pause because I was like, that was been on my mind lately, and I haven't said this to anybody, you know. And I started teasing apart the religious fervor that people and the presence of God, and that they were two different things. But regardless if these people were misguided in any sense, that God still works through them. And I started to realize that it's not about being right. It's not about having accurate information. That this church or this religion has the truth. It doesn't matter. That God is still operating in all of that, because none of us really know what the hell's going on. I mean, nobody knows. And but that was some, and this was a season of some interesting things happening. So I wasn't really a drinker. I still am not. I had a couple of years when I was a chef where that's what we did. We got off of work and I was a drinker, but back then I wasn't a drinker. I wasn't into the bar scene, but I wanted to be social and wanted to see girls and stuff. I was 20 something years old. So I found this little coffee shop called Java that was in the old city in Knoxville. And it wasn't far from my apartment, so I'd walk there in the evenings and I'd get a cup of coffee and I would read. But mainly I was just kind of people watching, but I always had a book, so wasn't the guy sitting in the corner just looking at everybody. I had a book and I would read some of it, but I would draw and sit there and just kind of people watch, wanting to make friends. But I'm awkward. I don't know how to make friends. I can't just walk up and be like, "Hi, how are you?" I was really shy. But this is a time when I was homesick. I wanted to go back to New York. I brought my dog with me, Sam, and Sam got hit by a car and got killed not long after I got there. And I was distraught, to say the least. And my cousin, Gina, who lived there, brought me to a place to bury my dog. I want to bury her somewhere pretty. And to this day, I have no idea where that was. It was just by a lake. But I was distraught. And my first knee-jerk reaction was, I want to go home. Screw this place. Screw Knoxville. I came here and it killed my dog. I want to go home. But I wasn't, at the same time, I didn't want to go home. But I was definitely homesick. And it was during this homesick period, and I was in culture shock as well, because I went from upstate New York, which isn't New York City, but still there's a big cultural difference between upstate New York and the South. Just the way people communicated, just the whole vibe is different. And one thing I realized when I moved down south is everyone talked really slow, like real slow. I hated talking to people because I would just be like, come on, just give me the information. And now that I've lived down here, for 30 years or whatever it's been, not 30 years, 20 something years, I guess I've slowed down because now I'm not, people just sound normal to me now. But so anyways, I went down to this coffee shop and I had met a couple of people, just some guys and some people around, and there was this one guy named Bryce, and he was from Tennessee, and the fact that I was from New York, he really thought that was cool for some reason, and he kept calling me Paisan. I think he just watched too many gangster movies based in New York, and he thought because I'm from New York that I'm Italian, and I didn't know how to explain to him I'm from cow country. Like my closest neighbor was a cow, But whatever. So I came in one evening, and he goes, "Hey, Paisan," and he said, "Hey, I want you to meet somebody." And I walk in, and it was this dude sitting there, and he goes, "Hey, this guy's from New York too." And I was like, "Oh, sweet," like somebody like me, it just made me feel, I wanted to meet him because he was from the same place I was from, and I was homesick. And he said his name was Rocco, and he had this thick, like Brooklyn, thick New York accent, like from the city, like the bowels of the city. And he goes, "Where are you from?" And I'm like, "I'm not from where you're from, man." And he told me he was from Brooklyn. And I was just like, "Hey, how you doing?" And I remember thinking the guy seemed kind of sketchy. Like, he seemed sketchy. Like, just that first impression is like, that's somebody I'm gonna trust. You know, um, it was kind of dirty and sketchy. Kind of feeling. So, anyways, I think we exchanged niceties. Talk. I don't remember any conversation that night, but just kind of talked and hung out, and and then I went out with a lot of people around, and I went home. And I think it was the next night I had gone back to the same coffee shop because that's what I did, and it was pretty dead in there. So I went and sat at this corner table by the window like I always did, and I didn't see anybody there that I knew. So I went and sat, and slowly it started filling up with people. And all of a sudden, Rocco come in, and he came in. He had a cup of coffee, and he saw me, and he made a beeline right for me and sat at the table across from me. And I had spoken to this guy once, and he sat down, and he just started talking. I don't remember the beginning of the conversation because you know, but I was drawing. I had paper and pen. And he asked me for a piece of paper, so I gave him a piece of paper, and he grabbed one of my pencils, and he looked at me. He says, "Look at this," and he drew a circle on the paper, and he said, "This is you." And then he drew another circle next to it, and he said, "This is the kingdom of heaven." And that got my attention. And he said, he goes, "You no." He drew the circle. It said, "This is earth. This is here." And then he drew another circle. It said, "This is the kingdom of heaven." And he said, "You got 1 foot here and 1 foot here." And he said, "The problem is," he says, like, "you don't open your freaking mouth." he says, he said, "You see things that are happening here that other people don't see." And he said, "And people need to know this." And he said, "If you don't open your mouth and start talking," he said, "God is going to spew you out of his mouth." And I didn't know what to think. I was just like, I didn't trust it, of course. I didn't trust it because I didn't trust anything. But I was just like, what the hell, And it seemed like an odd thing for somebody to make up or something, It was just weird. This dude, I didn't know this guy, you know. And then he looked at me and he goes, he got really close in, like he pulled focus, and he lowered his voice and he said, "There's no life in this body, Ben." Um, he said, "Not in the way you think." He said, "I'm a protector," and he said, "I'm gonna leave soon." And he said, "But one day, you're gonna need protecting." He said, "And I'm gonna be back to protect you." Um, and then he like leaned in real close and he said, "I love you, Ben." And I was like, "Yeah." I was really awkward at this point, And he's like, "I love you, Ben." And I was like, "Yeah, I love you too, man." And he's like, No. He goes, "I love you, Ben." And I just wanted him to get the hell away from my table because he was just weirding me out. I didn't know, what was I supposed to do? Just be like, "Yeah, I get it, man. I understand what you mean," or like, "This dude's freaking nuts." And to this day, I don't know what that was. I don't know if he was just a wackadoo that was saying these things, but so many things had happened, and since then, so many weird things have happened that people are pointing me towards something like, "Hey, look at this, look at this, look at this," and my relationship with God isn't passive. Anybody that knows me knows that if you talk to me long enough, we're going to talk about these things because this is all I ever want to think about. Like I conceptualize God constantly, and not saying that I'm some righteous person at all. I'm not saying that I'm like some learned anything. I'm a plumber, but I cannot help seeing God like in everything. And the things that he shows me and the blessings that he's given to me are mind-bending. And the biggest struggle that I have isn't believing that what I'm experiencing is real. The biggest struggle that I have is accepting that it's happening to me. Because if anybody deserves the blessings that I've been given in my life, it's not me. I don't know why God would talk to me the way he talks to me. And again, I'm not saying I'm not a prophet. I'm not trying to claim any sort of authority on anything. I'm just trying to express an experience I've been having. Um, in the videos coming up, I guess these two videos were just kind of giving a backstory of letting you know who I am, I guess, and just my kind of backstory. And before I just start spouting off some what's the word I'm looking for? Before I just spouting off some ideas of scripture and spirituality that you haven't heard before, because some of the things that I've been shown might challenge your accepted paradigm of who God is and what Christianity is, who Jesus was. And I always feel like when I'm having these conversations with people, firstly, if you talk to anybody that knows me and we've talked about God, they know that I've asked, am I talking too much? Because it's fire in my bones. I cannot help but want to share this, because I can't even begin to describe how beautiful an encounter with God is. Every religious belief that I have, every opinion that I have about myself or the world around me, when God shows up, all of that dissolves. My belief system, my opinions, my discernment, my judgment, all that is gone. God is not religious at all. But God can speak to us through the imagery and the mythology that's in the Bible. And I think that God can speak to us through anything. But because I was born the way I was born, raised the way I was raised, these are the mythology and the imagery that I have, and I'm realizing that God is throughout all things. And like organizing these videos and organizing my thoughts. I watch YouTube a lot, and I see these people that have like all these, they're ordered and organized, and I'm all ADD, so I can't promise that I'm going to be very clear, but I wanted to just kind of talk about who I am a little bit before I start spouting these things off. And I want to be clear that I am not a Bible scholar. I am not a religious authority. I haven't been given anything that anybody else isn't completely able to be a part of. Like I don't think I have any special blessings or special discernment or anything like that. This is just the experience that I'm having with God. And I hope that some of the things I'll present to you, you'll think about, weigh them, and my only hope is that it will maybe broaden your relationship with God a little bit, and maybe help you to see God differently, from a different angle, something to deepen your relationship. So as I start going through these video series, I'm just going to pick something and just talk about it. If you have questions or something that you want me to talk about, just leave them in the comments. And if it's something I know anything about, I'll definitely get on it. Yeah, thanks for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, just leave them below. And if you want to hear more from me, just like and subscribe. Like I said, this is my number 2 video on the YouTubes. So yeah, I'm going to try to make another one. So thank you.